When you look back over the course of the WWE's history and title reigns, there's never a title reign that gets talked about more than Bret Hart's final run with the WWF title. 1997 is debatably Bret Hart's best year in his entire 22 years as a professional wrestler. Even looking back at some of your favorite wrestlers' final years in the company, we could argue that Bret Hart had the best final year of any wrestler in WWE history. But today we're going to look back at the Hitman's last run with the WWF title, one of the most controversial title runs that we have ever seen in professional wrestling. In most of 1996, the WWF was getting destroyed in the television ratings thanks to WCW launching the NWO. Fans now wanted to get behind the cool and arrogant heels, and the NWO was the hottest thing in the world of pro wrestling. With this new trend in pro wrestling, the WWF in 1997 were starting to implement this strategy themselves. With the rise and push of Stone Cold Steve Austin, WWF needed a top guy to elevate him into a main eventer, and the guy that would be put into that spot was Bret the Hitman Hart. Bret Hart was always seen as the babyface, and he was the man that would be the role model on WWF television by always showing respect for his opponents and handling his business in the ring. The Hitman would always focus his attention on in-ring ability, and the excellence of execution would be something that Bret prided himself on. In the early months of 1997, Bret Hart's fourth WWF title reign was short-lived. He'd win a fatal four-way elimination match between himself, Stone Cold, The Undertaker, and Vader at WWF's In Your House Final Four. But the next night, he'd lose the title to Psycho Sid, thanks to Stone Cold costing him the title. But with the pairing of Stone Cold versus Bret Hart, Austin would push Bret to his limits and cause the Hitman to go off the rails and transition himself into a version of Bret Hart that fans have never seen before. In one of the greatest WrestleMania matches of all time, Bret Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin performed a double turn, with Bret Hart now getting all the heat after attacking Austin to end their match at WrestleMania. The World Wrestling Federation audience has always seen Stone Cold as the first man in the company to go against authority by feuding with Mr. McMahon, but actually, Bret Hart would be the first guy in the WWF to have an on-screen feud with Mr. McMahon, and people think that he's the one that is responsible for the Mr. McMahon character. We'd see McMahon and Bret constantly fight on camera, and this would play perfectly in the heel role for the Hitman. I really feel like this brought out the best in Bret Hart on the mic, because he was able to express himself in a way that he does in real life. This heel persona of Bret Hart would see the Hart Foundation make a comeback after Bret and Jim Neidhart split back in 1991. This new Hart Foundation was the top heel faction in the company for most of 1997 by constantly disrespecting American fans. While getting tremendous heat in every US city, week in and week out, the WWF would make appearances in Canada, and my God, these are absolutely some of the most incredible ovations that I have ever seen in professional wrestling. This is truly some of the best work in Bret Hart's entire career. With the Hitman as an established heel in the World Wrestling Federation, Bret had yet to have a WWF title run in 1997. As Bret Hart's stock was rising and his popularity was climbing as a heel, Bret would make his way into the WWF title picture as the new #1 contender against The Undertaker heading into SummerSlam. On the July 7th episode of Raw, Bret Hart tells his Canadian fans that if he doesn't win the WWF title at SummerSlam, that he'll never wrestle in the US ever again. Then fast forward to the July 21st episode of Raw, Shawn Michaels says that he has been assigned the duties as the special guest referee in the SummerSlam main event.
I will be the special referee.
The Heartbreak Kid says he wants to be the one accountable for Bret Hart never wrestling in the United States ever again. Now that all the stipulations are made and the stage is set for SummerSlam, this match between The Undertaker and Bret Hart is looking like a classic in the making. Undertaker and Bret Hart would have an exceptional match, one of, if not the best, that these two guys have ever had against each other. But to be honest, these two really haven't had many matches against each other, as crazy as that sounds. Shawn Michaels as the referee was obviously going to play a role at some point in this match. He calls the match right down the middle until the closing moments. Shawn and Bret would exchange back and forth many times during this match, and HBK finally tries to cheap shot the Hitman with a steel chair. This chair shot would connect to the Undertaker's skull, giving Shawn no choice but to count the pinfall for the Hitman, and this would give the Hitman his 5th WWF title reign. And as the Hitman began to celebrate, Shawn Michaels walks backstage knowing that there would be hell to pay with The Undertaker, and with this finish, the Bret Hart vs. Shawn Michaels feud would once again become the hottest thing in professional wrestling. Bret as the new WWF champion was the best move for the company from a fan's perspective, but in reality, Vince McMahon would paint himself into a corner, making Bret the new champion. The financial issues were about to play a serious factor in the months moving forward. On Raw's War the night after SummerSlam, Jim Ross interviews the Hitman, and Bret tells the world what he had to do to become the WWF champion for the 5th time. He says he proved once again that he's the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Bret goes on to end this promo by saying Shawn Michaels was one-sided toward The Undertaker during their SummerSlam match. And Bret goes on to say that as the new WWF champion, he is the new sheriff in town. This expands the drama even more between the Hitman and the Heartbreak Kid, but once the Hart Foundation wraps up this promo, we see the new commissioner of the WWF, Commissioner Slaughter. Slaughter immediately tells Bret that there is only one sheriff in town, and it's the commissioner. As the commissioner, he's demanding Bret to defend the title at In Your House Ground Zero against the Patriot. And later on in this episode, we'd see Shawn Michaels interviewed by Mr. McMahon, and this would be the enraged heel turn of HBK after being held accountable for Undertaker's loss at SummerSlam. With this heel turn from Shawn Michaels, this would spark the ongoing feud between him and The Undertaker to see who would go on to face Bret Hart at Survivor Series. Bret would now turn his attention to the Patriot, and this feud was just basically a USA versus Canada angle. For me, it didn't really do much because Bret already had a lot of heat with American fans anyway. Honestly, the fact that the Patriot was fighting for the WWF title in 1997 with all the talent that was on that roster is seriously crazy to think about. The crowds just never really got behind the Patriot when you go back and look at old episodes of Raw. And also something to mention here, the formation of DX would happen slowly when Bret was still feuding with the Patriot, and this would become important as we move closer to November. We now move into In Your House Ground Zero, and the match against the Patriot consisted of Bret getting absolutely booed out of the building when he was on his way to the ring. The match itself isn't terrible, but at the same time it's really not great. The British Bulldog in the middle of the match walks down in Bret's corner, but would be followed by Vader. Vader and the Patriot end up attacking the British Bulldog, and Vader even launches Bret Hart into the steel steps, and the referee saw this but still did not disqualify the Patriot. The two men would continue to fight it out, and Bret executes a picture-perfect reversal to the Patriot's sharpshooter, and this is where the Hitman would force the Patriot to submit, and he would retain the WWF title. To make matters even worse, Bret would choke the Patriot with the American flag after winning this match, solidifying himself as the most hated man in the WWF by American fans. And now flashback to 2 weeks ago at Friday night's main event, Bret Hart defended the WWF title against the man they call Vader. But it didn't take long for Owen and the rest of the Hart Foundation to come down and attack the big man. So with Vader looking for redemption against the Hitman, the two would clash in a no-holds-barred, non-title match on the September 8th episode of Raw's War. In a physical match that didn't last long, but saw Vader on the brink of becoming the new WWF champion, it would eventually turn into a brawl between the Hart Foundation, Vader, and the Patriot. Stone Cold would eventually come down and crash the Hart Foundation's assault on Vader and the Patriot, so this was basically just a 6-minute match with no winner and no outcome. This entire month would be a bit of a stalling period for Bret because The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels were in a very heated rivalry, and they would be meeting in the first Hell in a Cell match at Bad Blood in October, so this put Bret in a really awkward stage. So now we move into One Night Only, a show in Birmingham, England, and as weird as it sounds, there's no build for this Bret Hart vs. Undertaker match. But Bret Hart and the British Bulldog were both extremely over in the UK, so having a show in England would really shift the audience in the favor of the Hart Foundation. So Bret Hart would defend his title against The Undertaker, and the British Bulldog would compete against Shawn Michaels for the European title. Taker and the Hitman would have a very entertaining match with some really good spots, one particularly being the leg drop countered into a sharpshooter. I really thought that was a very cool spot, but the outcome would be Bret Hart winning this match via disqualification. Bret would end up getting his neck caught in the ropes, and The Undertaker would refuse to let referee Mike Chioda release Bret from the ropes, and Mike Chioda would end up disqualifying the dead man, and once again, Bret Hart would retain the WWF title. The night after One Night Only, Bret Hart would be in the main event against Goldust. The WWF champ would pick up the win, but the Heartbreak Kid would immediately storm the ring, and DX would begin the ambush on the Hitman. The Hart Foundation would soon jump in the ring, but The Undertaker would waste no time making his presence felt, and we see these three men in the ring for the first time since SummerSlam. But it would be the dead man who would stand tall by double chokeslamming Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, and the intensity heading into Bad Blood would be at an all-time high. At Bad Blood, Bret Hart would team with the British Bulldog in a tag team match against Vader and the Patriot. This felt like one of the longest tag team matches that I've ever seen in the WWF's history. Not a bad match at all, but the biggest part of Bad Blood would be Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker in the first ever Hell in a Cell match to see who would face Bret Hart at Survivor Series. Not only was this the first ever Hell in a Cell match, but this would be the remarkable debut of Kane. Kane would walk down the aisle, rip the cage door off its hinges, look The Undertaker right in the eyes, and he would tombstone The Undertaker, giving Shawn Michaels the victory at Bad Blood. The long-awaited rematch between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels was finally about to come to life. Two egos that definitely did not like each other behind the curtain, and it would not take long at all for these two to show their emotions on national television. On the October 6th episode of Raw, we could feel the tension rise more and more to levels that we'd never seen before on WWF television. DX takes the ring and HBK cuts a promo by mentioning the curtain call, and he absolutely buries Vince in this entire segment. The Hart Foundation crashes this segment and Bret unloads an entire shoot promo on DX. I'm willing to bet my money that this is absolutely a shoot from Bret Hart, but he would end up challenging Hunter Hearst Helmsley, and he ends this promo in the best way possible.
When that day comes, I'm gonna kick your little scrawny ass.
We would end up getting Hunter Hearst Helmsley versus Bret Hart to end this episode of Raw, but Shawn Michaels would cost Bret Hart this match by connecting Sweet Chin Music to the Hitman. The lead up to Survivor Series would mostly consist of a battle of words week after week, but on the following week, DX would interrupt Bret Hart on the Titantron. Shawn Michaels and Triple H would taunt the Hart Foundation, and Shawn says that the last time he took the Hitman up on his challenge was WrestleMania 12, where he kicked his ass for the WWF title. The pissed off look in Bret's eyes was very noticeable when DX delivers this promo, and Bret would finish off this segment by saying DX isn't even going to make it to Survivor Series. On the October 20th episode of Raw, Owen and Shawn would wrestle for the Intercontinental Championship, and this was a very good match, but it would end up getting thrown away due to disqualification. Stone Cold would stun the referee, and Bret would come to the ring and finally go to work on the Heartbreak Kid until both the Hart Foundation and DX would break up this ass kicking that Bret was about to give to Shawn. It was the first time that Bret got his hands on Shawn in this entire build to Survivor Series, but they would brawl again on the next week's episode of Raw as Bret was defending the WWF title against Ken Shamrock. After going back in time to rewatch old Raw episodes and pay-per-views from 1997, the 1 month wait for Survivor Series felt like an eternity. There's been a ton of anticipated matches that we've seen over the years, but the anticipation for Survivor Series 1997 has to rank in the top 3 all time. This pay-per-view is important for a lot of reasons. The first reason being that it was known by fans that this would be Bret Hart's final match in the WWF. The second reason being the real-life heat between Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. And with this match, fans knew that these two guys haven't met in the ring in 18 months. After all the smiles lost, the heel turns, and the sunny days, this was a must-see match. If you ever want behind-the-scenes information and footage, go back and watch Hitman Wrestling with Shadows. This is the best resource to go to whenever looking back at the Montreal Screwjob. The whole story behind Bret's contract issues with the WWF was simply Vince not being able to afford Bret Hart's contract. So therefore, they had to breach the contract. Vince McMahon and Bret Hart had previously agreed on a 20-year contract back in 1996, and Vince made it known that his current WWF champion was not seen as a future priority for the company heading into 1998. Bret Hart has made it perfectly clear many times that he did not want to leave the WWF, but was obviously left with no other option but to go to WCW after Survivor Series. And finally, we make it to the main event, Shawn Michaels versus Bret Hart for the WWF Championship for the last time. And ahead of the event on the Wrestling with Shadows documentary, Bret is seen going into a private room with Vince McMahon. Bret has a mic on during this conversation, and these two agree that Bret is going to retain the belt via disqualification in his homeland and was going to forfeit the belt the next night on Raw. Bret Hart said that he had Earl Hebner's word that he was not going to screw Bret out of the title at Survivor Series. And Bret has also said that a conversation between him and HBK took place where he tells Shawn that he'll drop the belt at Survivor Series. But Shawn replies with thanks, but I want you to know that I wouldn't do the same for you. This reply from Shawn Michaels pissed off the Hitman, and now Bret says he refuses to drop the belt to Shawn in Montreal. One thing I love about this match that really doesn't get talked about enough is the entrances. I really like how the cameramen followed both men from the locker room all the way to the gorilla position. I thought that added a lot of drama, and it really added a cool touch to the match. This is gonna sound crazy, but this is one of the only times I've ever gotten goosebumps watching a wrestling match. And these two men waste no time going after each other as they begin the match with a brawl, and there is no official bell to start this match, so they brawl all over the arena. They brawl in the crowd, they brawl at ringside, and they eventually end up at the top of the aisle. After all the brawling is over, eventually the match becomes underway, and to no surprise, this match starts out physical, and it remains physical through the entire match. Fast forward to the later portion of the match, Shawn would struggle to get the sharpshooter on Bret, but once he finally has it locked in, Earl Hebner calls for the bell as Bret is countering the submission. The camera zooms in on Bret's face, and he is confused, JR and King are confused, but it starts to sink in that we just witnessed Bret Hart get screwed out of the WWF title on national television. Bret would spit right in the face of Vince McMahon. Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and Earl Hebner get the hell out of Dodge, and they get to the locker room as quick as they can. And then we see Bret write WCW facing the hard cam. I know everyone is going to choose their side in this entire scenario because it's been happening for almost 30 years now, but for this video, this is going to be more about my honest opinion more than just choosing a side. As a Bret Hart fan, I can see why Vince McMahon had to get the belt off of Bret for the sake of saving his company, but if you knew you couldn't afford Bret in the long run, then why did you even make him the champion in the first place? But from Bret's point of view, I can understand all the frustration. Having to deal with Shawn in 1997 is already a damn headache to begin with, but having Vince lie right to your face right before the match makes it even worse. Not only Vince lying to his face, but Shawn also lies to his face by saying that he had nothing to do with the finish of the match.
My hands are clean of this one, I swear to God.
Apparently Triple H was the one who thought of the ring the bell finish, but Shawn telling Bret that he had nothing to do with the finish is honestly laughable. You can also see on the documentary at how pissed Bret's wife is too. She is just ripping into Triple H backstage. The cameras also get turned off, but Bret says that Vince came into his locker room and he rocked Vince with one good uppercut. And we later see Vince stumbling down the hallway after this altercation happened. And that is the final backstage story of Survivor Series 1997 in a very small nutshell, and that would cap off the final WWF title reign from Bret Hart. I know there's a lot more details that go into Survivor Series 1997, but personally, I would like to make a video by itself that just covers the Wrestling with Shadows documentary. The next night on Raw, Bret is obviously gone, but JR has a sit-down interview with Vince, and you already know Vince set this up to cover his own ass. When you look at this interview, in my opinion, and probably many others' opinions as well, Vince would set this segment up to make himself look like the asshole, and this is where Vince McMahon would set up his Mr. McMahon character, and he does this by blaming Bret for everything that happened in the Montreal Screwjob. Vince McMahon would blame Bret for their friendship coming to an end, and he would also blame Bret for the outcome of Survivor Series by saying,
Bret Hart screwed Bret Hart.
After going back to cover this title run, it could easily be seen as Bret's best work, but the thing that is crazy to think about the most is how old Bret was during this run. Even with Bret being 40 at this time, he looked phenomenal in the ring, and the age was not showing at all. You really just hate to see someone who worked their ass off for a company get screwed in the end, and that image of Bret riding WCW will be the final memory that some fans have of Bret Hart in the WWF. Vince would actually end up getting left empty-handed with neither guy, because HBK's back injury would happen just 2 months later at the Royal Rumble, which would cause him to go into early retirement. Bret would end up making his first WCW appearance at Starrcade 1997 as the special guest referee for the Larry Zbyszko vs. Eric Bischoff match. And not only that, he would be a part of the sloppy finish that ruined the Hogan vs. Sting main event. To end this video, I'll leave you by saying this. Both sides have their argument as to who is right and who is wrong, but just imagine working somewhere for 14 years and putting that company on your back for 5 of those years just to get completely slapped in the face to end it all. And for this last title reign from the Hitman, it was his most unique title reign that he'd ever have, and it would end a special year for Bret Hart. Attitude Era fans should thank Bret Hart, in my opinion, because he is the spark that ignited the WWF in the direction it needed to go in order to be the #1 wrestling company in America. As always, thank you for watching this episode. Please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed these videos so far, and leave a comment and let me know any video ideas you'd like to see on the channel moving forward.